Welcome back to Top Up's U.S. History course. I'm Dr. Chris Erskine, and today we're going to talk about the 1950s. We finished up World War II, the last 2 or 3 chapters, several lessons, and now we're clear of that. The Cold War is on, and we're going to talk about the Eisenhower era. Now, I want to add something before we start. There is so much, like the last chapter, there is so much in this chapter to talk about. So many things, and we can't possibly talk about them all. I talk to my students about this stuff in the classroom for hours, but because we're just doing 8 to 12, 15-minute lessons on the video lessons, you're going to have to make sure you read the material, and you can expect essay questions from this chapter and from World War II, because there's just a lot of really good stuff in here. So the first slide I want you to turn and look at is the 1952 election. Now, pay attention to this, because this slide, remember Truman won last time, and this time, the 1952 election, the South is still blue. The South is the party of the Democrats, and they're against Lincoln. Not now. We're going to talk about why that changes in the next chapter. But what we see here is that this changes, that this is blue still in the South, and Eisenhower wins election. Eisenhower's Republican, and he wins most of the country in 1952. So we get started. When he comes into office, the Korean War is going. Eisenhower's from Kansas. Looking at the next slide, he's Republican. He's Presbyterian, which means he's Christian. He's Protestant. And he inherits the Korean War from Truman. And his slogan is, during his campaign in the 1956, is everything's booming except for the guns. And that means that the economy is booming, it's doing really well, but we're not at war. That's in 1956. In 1953, when he comes into office, actually, there is a war going on. So let's talk about some American things about culture. That's really what I want to talk about in this chapter, because American culture really changes in the 1950s. It's called the silent generation. They don't protest a lot of the things that are going on politically, and really there's not a whole lot to protest economically. The war's over and people are happy, but we do see some changes, some things that are worth protesting, and we'll talk about those in the next lesson. But most people in the silent generation, they just kind of accepted things like they were. They didn't protest very much. Fast food, McDonald's is, and some fast foods were created in the 1940s, but when they really kind of explode and take off, become very popular in the 1950s. And you can see this 15-cent hamburgers at McDonald's. And this is the first one is in California, Santa Barbara, California. On the next slide, the 1950s, we see GIs, or government issue. We call soldiers in the United States GIs. They're going off to college, they're coming back, they're using money from fighting in the war, and the government's helping them get a college degree because they were in the Army. Women are staying at work. So before World War II, women were raising the family. During World War II, women are raising the family and working, because somebody has to make airplanes and tanks and guns and ships and all of these things. And so women are actually going to work as well. Now the soldiers come home, and a lot of the women go back to the home as well, but a lot of the women stay at work. And so what this means is that you have so much more money going pumped into the economy, because you have more money in each house. Instead of one person working, you now have 2, and so you have more money. And so this is really good for the economy. There's 26 million cars in the United States in 1945. 15 years later, there's 60 to 70 million. So it's doubled, almost tripled in just 15 years. The growth of highways. 1956, we get the Interstate and Defense Act, which builds more highways, because we need highways if we're going to be able to grow the economy, but we also need highways to transport massive amounts of troops. There's also the Highway Act, which builds super speed highways in 1958. That means we don't have to go on these curvy mountainous roads that are really slow. We can now go super fast on highways. And so Eisenhower is really kind of the father of the American highway system in the United States in the 1950s. On the next slide, we see the Defense Education Act, and that's in 1958. And this is kind of spurred on because the United States is falling behind the Soviet Union in science. The Soviet Union is this all-powerful country, and we think that we're better than them in the 1950s, and suddenly we feel like, wait, they're better than us in science. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that the Soviet Union beats us to space, and that's really what it comes down to. The 1950s, we see rock and roll, we see TV shows, Father Knows Best, and we've seen TV shows before the 1950s. A lot of them have to do with music. But for the first time in the 1950s, we see a lot of TV shows that have to do, it's what we call a sitcom, a situation comedy, which means every week it's a scenario and you see the family doing their thing and it's funny. And so these TV shows become really popular in the 1950s. And this one is called Father Knows Best.
Robert Young and Jane White, with Eleanor Donahue, Billy Gray, and Lauren Chapin in Father Knows Best.
We missed you at dinner, dear. Sorry you had to work so late.
It seemed like everybody in Springfield had insurance problems today. Where are the children?
Kathy's next door. Betty's at a sorority meeting and Bud's upstairs.
Quiet evening at home. I can use it.
Thanks.
So quiet, I don't know whether I can concentrate or not.
Now, today, we wouldn't have a TV show called Father Knows Best because we don't think that way anymore. We also think that the mom's opinion is also important. And sometimes mom knows best, and sometimes grandma knows best, and sometimes grandpa knows best. So it's not always father. And sometimes the kids know best, but not as often as mom and dad know. So you remember that next time you get into an argument with your mom or your dad, or they tell you to do something. You remember, mom knows best and dad knows best. We also have Jerry Lee Lewis is there on the bottom in this slide. He's standing on top of a piano. He was really flamboyant, and he's sang really fast songs, and new rock and roll music is coming out in the 1950s. If you want to listen to some Jerry Lee Lewis music, you can look on the internet and look for, on Yoku perhaps, and you can look for some music. A famous song of his was called Great Balls of Fire. And on the top middle there, we see Elvis Presley standing there, and he's doing his dance, and Elvis Presley is the king of rock and roll. And you can look at some Elvis Presley music on the internet as well. And the organization, man, people going to work for companies, big companies, factories, and a lot of white-collar workers. It's called IBM, International Business Machines. Becomes very famous during this point as well. They're making a lot of computers, making typewriters. American culture is really being shaped during the 1950s, and a lot of this has to do with the radio and TV. Now, on the next slide, we can see the nifty 50s is what they're called. Father knows best. Does he really know best? What is the American dream? Well, 2.5 children and a white picket fence. Country life. We can live outside of the city in the suburban rural area. We can have a nice car, a nice house. We can have a family in the suburbs. You can get an education wherever you want. And you can do anything you want. That's the American dream. That's what everyone wants. Now we can see on the right, we can see this picture. It's everyone except for the mom, because the mom has to stay home and cook, and she's got to be in an apron, and she's got to be preparing food for the husband and the family. On the next slide, you can see the best years. Now, often, if you talk to your grandparents in the United States, if you live in the United States, and most of you don't, but if you were to talk to my grandparents, they'll remember the 1950s as just maybe the best years. And that's sometimes they're called the best years. Sometimes they're called the nifty 50s. But why do people remember them as the best years? Because they really weren't. The Cold War is going on. McCarthyism is going on, and we don't talk about this, McCarthyism, in this lesson, but you'll read about this in your book. Women are barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. There's a huge gap between rich people and poor people. There's racial discrimination between blacks and whites. The Korean War is going on. There's a lot of really terrible things happening. But people remember the past very fondly, and they don't always remember the bad things. And you can see from this advertisement, a woman is opening a bottle of ketchup, and it says, "You mean even a woman can open it?" Again, it's just kind of sexist, and it thought that women were weaker and not able to do things that men could do. On the next slide, the best years. There were some good things about it. Marriage was more stable. Religious values were strong in the United States. Families were large. There is no war after the Korean War. Suburbs are growing. People are moving into nice houses. The middle class is growing. Interstates, fast highways, and shopping centers are growing. And people are beginning to move west. Now look at this picture on the right. It's Christmas time. And what does the wife want for Christmas, according to the advertisement? Well, she's in there in a dress, and she wants a vacuum cleaner so she can clean the house. Now, I think if I got my wife a vacuum cleaner to clean the house for Christmas, she probably would not be very happy. But we have this idea that women were hanging around in the house in their dress, just waiting to clean, waiting to cook, waiting to serve the husband. And maybe it was back then in the 1950s, but I would be willing to bet you that the people that invented these magazine advertisements, I bet they weren't women. I bet they were men. We can look at the next slide. America is, at the time, still looking at the 1950s and in culture, America is post-industrialist, meaning we're past the factories. We're now white collar. And TV shows like Father Knows Best, and there was another one that I watched when I was a kid called Leave It to Beaver, and these are black and white TV shows. Women's employment is going up, even though the advertisements we see, women look like they're at home. Actually, more women are going to work. And also, illegitimate births are increased. Now, illegitimate births in the United States, this means that we don't know who the father is. And so that means that family values are beginning to go down. Women are having babies to men they're not married to, or to men that they just are with for a couple of days, and then the man disappears. And so this is also a problem, and it's a rising problem in the 1950s. And we can see in this advertisement, honey, don't worry, at least you didn't burn the beer. And so in this case, again, the woman's at home and she's burned the food, but at least she didn't ruin everything. And that's the man talking. On the next slide, we see a woman about buying some product at the grocery store, and the husband is giving her a spanking. And if your husband ever finds out, you're going to get a spanking. Today, these advertisements are not okay, but it's funny to see them from the 1950s. And on the next slide, we got a couple of more of these. And here's a page from a newspaper on the left side, this page from the newspaper, and it says, wives, circle those things that you want for Christmas. And look, all of those things have to do with cooking or cleaning in the house. So I'll get you something. And on the one on the right, this is one for a medicine called Mornidine, or Mornidine. And it's a woman who's pregnant and she's sick in the morning and she's pregnant and doesn't want to get up. But the medicine is invented so that it make her feel better. And so the advertisement says, now she can cook breakfast again. So she's got to be pregnant and sick, and she can still get up and cook your husband breakfast. Just very interesting times in the 1950s. And Americans look back at these advertisements today, and it's very funny and also kind of sad. On the next slide, we see two men standing on top of a cliff, and it says, men are better than women. And there's one of them holding a rope, and there's a woman hanging off the edge of the rope on the cliff there, about to fall down. Now, on the next slide, we see this popular icon. I bet some of you may know who this is. This is Marilyn Monroe. She's the first bombshell, blonde bombshell, we call them in the United States, actress. There were others certainly before her, but she's one of the first during the modern age of television in the 1950s and going into the 1960s. Very famous. And the next slide, we have Elvis Presley. Both Elvis and Marilyn Monroe died from drug overdoses. Very unfortunate. So the best years, onto the next slide, church membership soars, goes up. We add under God to the Pledge of Allegiance of the American flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag. For one nation it stands, under God. And so this is, we add this because we contrast this to the Soviets who don't believe in anything religious. And so we think we want to make sure people know that we believe in God. And today we kind of look back at the 1950s and some of those things and we think, that was maybe, how do we feel about that? Politicians proclaimed that they were religious. They would try to get votes this way. Pop culture adored religious figures like Billy Graham, who was a preacher, and he just passed away in 2018. Republican President Eisenhower is the only Republican president in office from 1933 to 1972, actually, when Nixon runs for office and wins the presidential election. And he doesn't seek to change what the Democrats have done in office, particularly FDR with the New Deal. He preserves it. He wants to create some stability in the country. And so many things that are happening culturally in the United States while Eisenhower is president. It's a fun time. It was good years, but was it so good? And we're going to talk maybe about why it wasn't so good in the next lesson. So, all right, we'll see you guys then. All right, bye-bye.